Hello, and welcome to the Obscure History interview series. I'm Dana Rovang, and today I'm joined by Professor Jonathan Noyalas from Shenandoah University. Today we're going to be talking about events that occurred during the American Civil War in 1864 concerning the Battle of Cedar Creek. A poem about this battle, entitled Sheridan's Ride, is likely the origins of the phrase "save the day," which is commonly used in superhero movies and comic books. Quickly written after the battle took place, this poem, Sheridan's Ride, became incredibly popular, and it's probably not a stretch to say this poem went viral. The poem is about Union Major General Philip Sheridan and how he had to quickly make his way down from Winchester to the site of the battle at Cedar Creek. In true save-the-day fashion, the poem dramatically depicts how Sheridan arrived in the nick of time and reinvigorated his troops so that they managed a victory in the face of crushing defeat by the Confederate forces. This poem functioned as a bit of wartime propaganda. It came as a turning point in the war and just before the presidential election with Lincoln running for re-election. To help us make sense of this battle, poem, and their larger place in history, Jonathan Noyalas is here to give us some deeper perspective about the Battle of Cedar Creek and poem that sprung from these events, Sheridan's Ride by Thomas Buchanan Reed. Jonathan is one of the preeminent scholars regarding the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley and Sheridan's Ride. Jonathan is the director of the Shenandoah Valley's McCormick Civil War Institute and a history professor, and he's the editor of the Journal of the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War era. He's the author or editor of 15 books, including The Battle of Cedar Creek, Victory from the Jaws of Defeat, and an essay in a volume entitled We Learned That We Are Indivisible. The title of the essay is Its Thrill Will Never Die, Sheridan's Ride in War and Memory. Welcome, Jonathan. Thank you for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
So happy that you could join us. So, set this battle stage for us, given the context of the location in the Shenandoah Valley and the time period that it takes place in the Civil War. What was at stake with this particular battle? Seems like a lot.
Yeah, sure. So as you know, as you said it in your opening remarks, the presidential election of 1864 looms large over everything that happens in the late summer and early autumn of 1864. And so Philip Sheridan, who commanded the Army of the Shenandoah, when he came to command in early August of 1864, he was told by President Lincoln, by General Ulysses S. Grant, who was General-in-Chief at the time, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, that he needed to be very careful about what he did in the Shenandoah Valley, because Lincoln and Grant and Stanton understood that if you engage Confederates under Jubal Early in the Valley, you engage them prematurely, you lose a battle. It's not just about the loss on the battlefield, but how is this going to translate at the polls for Lincoln in his bid for re-election? So really, during the first month of Sheridan's command tenure in the Valley, there really wasn't a great deal that went on. So there was a lot of maneuvering and some minor skirmishes and scrapes here and there, kind of between Harper's Ferry and Fisher's Hill, which is located just south of Strasburg, Virginia. And then you get to the second week of September, and Abraham Lincoln starts to get impatient, not only because has Sheridan really done nothing, but he's becoming more impatient because William Tecumseh Sherman has captured Atlanta. Lincoln knows Atlanta's fall is going to be significant to his chance for re-election. And so Lincoln feels that the missing piece of the puzzle here is the Shenandoah Valley. So he kind of spurs Phil Sheridan into action. Sheridan wins a series of victories beginning on September 19th, 1864 at the Third Battle of Winchester. 3 days later at the Battle of Fisher's Hill. He has his campaign of destruction of the valley known as the Burning. And then once you get to the second week of October, there is this sentiment among some, I don't want to say all, but among some in the Army of the Shenandoah that Jubal Early is done for, that he has suffered too many defeats, his army is too demoralized, and they're not really going to do anything. So Jubal Early, who came to the Shenandoah Valley in June of 1864, his role was to serve as a diversion to distract Union attention away from Petersburg and to make war planners in Washington, D.C. uneasy. Is Early going to pop out of the valley as he did in July of 1864? Is he going to push towards the capital? Is he going to invade the North? And so Early was really a kind of a stubborn, cantankerous fellow, really didn't want to admit defeat. And so Early came up with this idea to launch a surprise attack against the Army of the Shenandoah in those early morning hours of October 19th, 1864. And it wasn't a surprise to everyone. You know, when Early's attack happens around 4 o'clock in the morning of October 19th, 1864, there were some officers, General William Emory, for instance, who commanded the Army's 19th Corps. He had basically anticipated that something would happen, that Early wasn't done. But there were other officers, you know, Horatio Wright, who was in temporary command of the Army while Sheridan was away in Washington meeting with Secretary of War Stanton and President Lincoln, really thought that Early, you know, didn't pose much of a threat. And so the battle started out abysmally for the Union Army. It was chaos and pandemonium at various points on the field. And as you noted in your opening remarks, you know, Philip Sheridan, who had arrived the previous night in Winchester, that following morning, October 19th, he wakes up, he rides, he finds a disorganized army, rallies them, and achieves that victory. And I don't think you can really exaggerate and overstate what the Battle of Cedar Creek means. It is the last major military action in the Valley. There's a lot of other little stuff that happens, you know, kind of irregular warfare, bushwhackers, guerrillas that you're dealing with. But this is a battle that, by and large, wrests the Shenandoah Valley from Confederate control. And this is a victory that I think really helps cement Lincoln's chance for re-election in early November.
Okay. Yeah, that really does seem like there's a lot at stake. How far away is this location from, say, Washington, D.C.? We know that, according to the poem, it says 20 miles from Winchester to the site of the battle. But it also seems like this is really threatening Washington from this location. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So where we're at, you know, in the lower Shenandoah Valley, it's only about 70 miles away from Washington, D.C. So it is all things considered, you know, pretty close, too close for comfort for the president.
Sure. And that would explain why he was certainly concerned about Jubal Early's sort of hold on that area. So to briefly recount for our listeners who haven't, read maybe the piece, the poem talks about, he, as you say, he wakes up in the morning to cannon fire. And this is, I think, more of a, let's talk about the poem, but also talk about how actual events may or may not have been reflected in the poem. We also have his memoirs that sort of can inform this as well. But he's woken up, he hears the cannon fire, and then, according to the poem, he hops on his horse and rides 20 miles. And he's met with cheers and sort of turns the tide. He comes sort of triumphantly in and rallies his troops to push back the Confederate troops and give them sort of a resounding defeat. So talk about the personalities of both Sheridan and Jubal Early. How were they regarded by their men? We know that, as you say, Sheridan was not highly respected by Lincoln so much. So this sort of was a turning point for him in his career as well. Yeah,
I think there are some things that, interestingly enough, Jubal Early and Philip Sheridan have in common. So, Phil Sheridan is about 16 years Jubal Early's junior. Both of those guys were graduates of West Point. They had sort of middling careers as students at West Point. But these are guys who are stubborn. I think they are at times cantankerous. They are aggressive. Jubal Early, in particular, was not a well-liked man, so he's not a warm and fuzzy, Care Bear-like individual. I think if you look at Jubal Early, he has a steady rise, from the outset of the war, commanding the 24th Virginia, to, of course, the point he's in the Valley, commanding the Army's Second Corps. Jubal Early had the ability to get things done. So I think from a tactical standpoint, from a strategic standpoint, if you gave Jubal Early orders, as Robert E. Lee did in June, move from Petersburg to the Valley, clear the Valley, threaten Washington, create a distraction, do all those types of things, Jubal Early was quite successful in carrying those things out. I don't think that there was a great sense of admiration and love for Early among his men during the war. I think there was a healthy dose of respect for Jubal Early. But he was not someone that I think a lot of Confederate soldiers really were able to establish a connection with. Philip Sheridan, on the other hand, is someone. So, I mean, Sheridan has, a mixed military record. He starts out the conflict serving on the staff of Henry Halleck, and then he kind of, steadily rises, kind of gains the attention of Ulysses S. Grant during fighting in the West in the early part of the conflict, has a mixed bag during the Overland Campaign, commanding Union cavalry. But it's really, when Sheridan comes into the Valley that he comes into his own, his star is on the rise, and people, across the United States really begin to understand who he is and what he is about. And there's probably, I think, a fair amount of people who don't realize this. But when General Grant decided to create what we call the Army of the Shenandoah, it's really known officially as the Middle Military Division. So General Grant wanted to assemble the largest army ever created in the Shenandoah Valley, about 40,000 men. He wanted to put them under an aggressive commander. Sheridan was not Grant's first choice for this position. And there was a small litany of generals, from William B. Franklin, who was a Democrat, who was most notorious for his conduct at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Lincoln, discounted him immediately because he was a Democrat. He was a supporter of McClellan, and he's not going to give such an important command to someone who doesn't want him to win re-election. George Meade was offered up as a potential commander for this, but Lincoln had some misgivings about this. Lincoln even was toying around with the idea, perhaps somewhat in jest, through Grant's suggestion to make George McClellan commander of the Army of the Shenandoah, because then he wouldn't have to deal with McClellan politically. But ultimately, what sold Lincoln on Sheridan, and Lincoln had some misgivings about Sheridan, largely because, not necessarily due to his military record, but because of his age. Sheridan was only 33 years old at this point in time. And both Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton thought, Sheridan has a mixed bag as of recent as cavalry commander in the Army of the Potomac. Can he handle such really important, immense responsibilities, not only from a military standpoint, but from a political one as well? Because again, everything that happens here is going to directly affect the presidential election of 1864. And so what really sold Lincoln on Sheridan and sold Stanton on Sheridan was Grant's ability to capture how Sheridan was able to inspire and motivate men. And General Grant had seen this, firsthand at various points during the conflict, both in the Eastern and Western theaters of the war. And Sheridan had this ability to energize his men, to galvanize his men. And you can be a great tactician and strategist, as Early was, but you have to have the ability to inspire your men. You have to have the ability to make your men believe in you. And this is kind of what, Sheridan is able to do at Cedar Creek. And, Sheridan is a guy who's not really thinking about, all the fame and how his star is going to be on the rise when he went into this battle. He wasn't looking for kind of these, public relations opportunities. It just worked out that way for him.
Almost the reluctant hero in a way. He's there to do his job.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an episode that happens right after the Battle of Cedar Creek where, once victory is secure, Sheridan is sitting around a campfire in front of the Belgrove Mansion House, where it was that served as the Army's headquarters. And he was having a conversation with George Crook. And he told Crook, he said, "I'm going to get much more credit for this than I deserve." So Sheridan was aware at that moment, how this was probably going to be a major thing because of the timing of it. I don't think Sheridan could have ever imagined there would be poetry written about this and art and sculpture, created about this. But I think Sheridan sensed how this was going to really define him.
So, yeah, even at the time, he understood the import of it. So in terms of the poem, there are some dramatic liberties, perhaps. We have, of course, Sheridan's account too. And if you read it, there is sort of a sense of like him trying to correct the record on a few things. So for instance, he talks about a regular pace, like proceeding with not only with, by him, he's not by himself as depicted in the poem. He has a group around him, his men, a smallish group. It's not a platoon or something, but he also talks at moving at a regular pace, whereas the poem is sort of this pell-mell gallop down the road. And it's accompanied, of course, in later publications by woodcuts that show him singularly sort of racing down the road. So he's trying to push back on some of these things. What is your sense about the accuracy of the poem, how it sort of inflated him in that regard, how he felt about that situation, and sort of getting the credit where he didn't feel like it was, even though he knew he could inspire people, as he tells in his own account that he knew that if his men had followed him once, they might follow him again, and he just sort of went with that. So let's talk about how he, kind of pushed back on those sort of dramatic representations, but still kind of in a way embodied them.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, like, a lot of literature, there's literary license that the author takes. And certainly Thomas Buchanan Reed takes a lot of license with the poem. So let's kind of talk about the reality of Sheridan's move from Winchester south to Middletown, and we can kind of interject some other points in there. So Sheridan, when he arrived back in Winchester late on the night of October 18th. He sent a note to Horatio Wright in Middletown, who was the temporary commander of the army, and basically asked him, is everything okay? Do you want me to come there, or can you wait until tomorrow? And Horatio Wright basically said, everything's fine. We have everything covered. Nothing to worry about. It's all quiet here. So Sheridan bedded down for the night at the Logan House in Winchester. So this is a structure that still stands. So if any of your listeners ever come to Winchester, the Logan House sits right at the corner of Piccadilly and Braddock Streets. It's now Kimberly Skiff's. You can't miss this house. Big white columns, all that kind of stuff. So Sheridan woke up that morning, and he started to receive reports from his pickets on the southern outskirts of Winchester that there was artillery fire in the distance. And so the actual distance from Winchester to Middletown, it's about a dozen miles. So, Reed in the poem, he writes 20 miles. So it's a little bit of license in order to make it work, I suppose, for him. So Sheridan hears these reports initially, and he kind of discounts them because he was aware of the fact that there was a large reconnaissance going out that morning, and he thought, well, this is probably what this is. But then as he was eating breakfast, he kind of has this sense of uneasiness. Well, maybe I better check it out, because one thing that Sheridan understood is that Jubal Early was a stubborn person, that he was not willing to admit defeat, because there had been several instances already during Jubal Early's time in the Valley where you thought he's done for, he's not going to attack, and lo and behold, there he is. He launches an assault. So Sheridan rides a few miles south of Winchester, and he gets to the vicinity of Kernstown. And according to his staff officers who are with him, so you're right, he has a small little party. It's not a huge contingent. So he gets to Kernstown, and according to his staff, gets off his horse, Rienzi, puts his ear to the ground, and he listens for a moment. And then Sheridan gets up, doesn't really say anything to his staff, and now he kind of spurs his horse into a higher gear and starts riding with greater haste. He moves about another 3 or 4 miles to the vicinity of what is Stevens City today. So during the time of the war, Stevens City was known as Newtown. And it's there that Phil Sheridan starts to see the signs of, something catastrophic has happened. He starts to see ambulances with wounded Union soldiers streaming toward, northward. And it was kind of at this moment that Sheridan was thinking in his mind, well, what am I going to do? And so Sheridan knew, as he writes about and as others have written about him, that he had this magnetism about him. He had this ability to inspire and energize men. And so his initial reaction was to actually order the entire army to withdraw north toward Winchester. But he thought, well, this would be demoralizing to the men. It would illustrate to them that I don't have any faith in you to kind of reverse the fortunes of the morning. And so he decided that he would continue south toward Middletown. He would rally his men, reorganize his men, inspire his men, and then launch a counterattack. And so Sheridan arrived on the field, probably in between 10 and 11 o'clock that morning. And when he arrived, one of the first people to greet him was Horatio Wright. And so one of the things that oftentimes people maybe don't quite fully understand about his arrival is that the Army was in the process of being reorganized when Sheridan arrived. So Horatio Wright, despite all of the disaster that had befallen the Army that morning, he was able to pull them back, reorganizing them into something, resembling order by late that morning. But Horatio Wright wrote, this was to his wife after the battle, although he had reorganized the Army, he was so happy that Phil Sheridan had arrived, because he said, Phil Sheridan had the uncanny ability to do what I could not, and that was to inspire the men. And so, the men in Sheridan's command might not have believed in Horatio Wright, but they believed in Sheridan. And so, again, this is something that Sheridan is quite well aware of. So when you look at the poem Sheridan's Ride, this is just one of many pieces of poetry that's produced about this event. It's the most well-known. And you're right. I mean, there's a lot of license in here. There's a lot of things that are inaccurate. But what's always fascinating to me about the poem is that the real agency is given to the horse, Rienzi. It's Rienzi that's sensing the danger, and I've got to get my, master to Middletown to rally this army. And so that's always been an interesting point for me. So, Sheridan, again, I think he's aware of how this poem sort of embellishes things. But I think that to an extent, Philip Sheridan, he was well aware of not only what Reed had done, but he was starting to become aware, not only in 1864, but for decades after, what other poets and artists were doing. And Phil Sheridan did not have any problem at all venting his opinions about what he thought about these poems. So, historically, Sheridan knows the distance between Winchester and Middletown. He doesn't really go after Reed. Reed, interestingly enough, isn't just a poet, but he's an artist. I mean, he produces a painting of Sheridan's Ride for the Union League in Philadelphia in the aftermath of the war. And so he spends some time with Sheridan, interviewing him, sketching, different pieces of equipment and all this kind of stuff. And when he produces it, Sheridan says, oh, this is a great likeness of me. I love it. But there are other images that are produced that Sheridan just absolutely detests. And if I can just tell this story real quick, in 1886, so this is 2 years before Phil Sheridan passes away, there was an artist, his name was Thurda Thulstrup, who produced a painting as part of a series of Civil War paintings that was done for a publication by Lewis Prang and Company. And it's actually the version that's on the cover of my book about the Battle of Cedar Creek. So it shows, the army lined up and Phil Sheridan with his flag in his hand and his staff riding behind him, and he's riding up and down the lines. And so after this painting was produced, Thulstrup and Prang were excited. They sent a copy to Sheridan, and Sheridan opened this up. And by this point in time, Sheridan is general-in-chief of the armies. So, this is a high-profile figure, and he just hated it. He hated it because it was completely inaccurate. And Sheridan had a rant, and there was one of his staff officers who was with him, and he basically recorded this rant. And Sheridan loved to swear. Every kind of possible swear word you could imagine was coming out of his mouth. at this point. And one of the reasons we know about this reaction is because his staff officer thought it would be funny to leak it to the press. So newspapers across the country ended up carrying this reaction. And I could imagine how devastating this would be to Third to Thulstrup and Louis Prang and Company. They're trying to sell these things and make money. And here's the guy that's the epicenter of this painting. And you're just, he's just trashing the whole thing. What's interesting and funny to me is that after the account was published, Sheridan was not angry that his review of this painting was made public. Sheridan was an upfront, honest kind of person. He would tell you to your face. I mean, if Thulstrup came into the room, he would say, I think this painting is terrible. I think it's an inaccurate description of what actually happened. What bothered Sheridan is that the newspapers published the swear words. And he said, I'm so bothered by the fact, because he's trying to portray himself as a good Catholic, and he's bothered by the fact that, people are going to think that I'm in the habit of swearing. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic here, from my perspective.
I love that story. So how was it inaccurate? Because you say that there are other depictions that he really thought were good, like James Kelly's sculpture. And that's one of Rienzi sort of in mid-charge. He has his hat in his hand. Yeah. And with the Third of Thulstrup, it's a flag. And is that the sticking point for him? Or is it there's something more? He also talks in his own depiction about jumping over some barricades. And I don't know if that's something that he wanted to have as part of that. I love that he is insisting on accuracy in his sort of depictions of his own heroic deeds. So it's interesting.
Yeah. So the thing that really bothered Sheridan was the flag, and this idea that he was writing, so that the painting makes it appear that the entire army is lined up, and Sheridan just grabs his flag and he's writing up and down the entire lines. And that's not how it happened. It really was more, when Sheridan arrived on the field, he is writing amongst pockets of troops. And so now you're probably talking a few hundred troops at a time that he is making his presence known and that he's addressing. And it's interesting because there are Confederate soldiers, late that morning, early that afternoon, who can hear, a lot of noise coming from the Union lines. And they can hear all these shouts and stuff. And they're actually thinking that the Union Army is being reinforced. Well, kind of technically it was being reinforced with Sheridan, but they thought that there were like additional, thousands of troops who were being brought into the field to bolster the Army's ranks. So it's really more, Sheridan is meeting these men kind of piecemeal on the field. So he's not doing it in the manner that it's depicted. And Sheridan goes on, he says, in this sort of review of Thulstrup's painting, he said he kind of depicts me with a whole regiment of cavalry following me. And he said, that's simply not how it happened. And Sheridan really, I think, had a greater appreciation for those artists who were just focusing in on him and the horse. So if you think about Thomas Buchanan Reed's depiction of it, it's largely just Phil Sheridan. There's some litter of the battlefield on the ground. His favorite version of the event was a sculpture that was done by James Kelly in the early part of the 1880s. And this is actually the one that Phil Sheridan chose to grace the covers of his memoirs.
So one thing that comes to mind, and maybe this is just a sticking point in my own imagination, is, as you say, there are sort of pockets of troops. What we're also seeing is in, say, the painting with the flag is that it's sort of a wide open expanse. It's like Gettysburg, where there's just like this big field that's open. Is that accurate in terms of like how it took place? Or I'm thinking it's a lot more wooded. There are sort of more pockets and ways of defensive sort of abilities to sort of hunker down in. I'm just, for my own curiosity, I'm just interested in sort of the landscape.
Yeah, sure. The landscape around that part of Middletown, it is largely open. So there are some houses that are scattered, around the fields. But but it's largely open agricultural land, wheat fields. I mean, wheat is kind of a staple crop in the Shenandoah Valley, corn. Mm-hmm. So you would have seen that, dotting the landscape. So yes, I mean, I think in that regard, when you look at Tholstrup's image, that is an accurate element to it.
All right. Well, that does help. Maybe it was the only accurate element in his painting. So you've written a little bit about some of the people who were the informants for Sheridan. They included Rebecca Wright, who was a Quaker school teacher, and Tom Laws, who was a man of African descent, who was a source of information for Sheridan. What can these people sort of tell us about the practice of information gathering during the Civil War?
Yeah, so the stories of Rebecca Wright and Tom Laws, they are two of the most critical individuals who helped contribute to Union success in the Valley. So as you pointed out, Rebecca Wright is a young Quaker school teacher. She is a Unionist sympathizer in Winchester. And Winchester, although admittedly it is ardently pro-Confederate, there is about 10 to 15% of the population who are pro-Unionists. And they are Unionists for a variety of reasons. Some of them are Unionists because they're transplanted Northerners. Some of them are extremely opposed to what the Confederacy stands for. They're opposed to slavery. They're opposed to what they perceive as rebellion and treason. And then you have individuals like the Wrights who are Quakers, who are opposed to war of all sorts. And so, generally when you have more pacifist sects like Quakers, other groups like, Brethren and Mennonite in the Shenandoah Valley and elsewhere, they would prefer there to be no conflict. But if they have to help someone, they're going customarily to the side of the Union, with, of course, always some exceptions. So Rebecca Wright figures prominently into this story of events leading up to the Third Battle of Winchester. And so, Third Winchester was fought September 19th, 1864. I do not believe that Third Winchester would have happened had it not been for Rebecca Wright and Thomas Laws. So, earlier we had talked about all the pressure that was placed on Phil Sheridan. Don't attack Jubal Early unless you can be certain of defeating him, because if you're defeated by Jubal Early, it's going to be bad for the military. It's going to be bad for Lincoln's chances for re-election. And so when you get to that second week of September, when President Lincoln is becoming extremely impatient, wants Philip Sheridan to do something, to build off the momentum of Sherman's capture of Atlanta, Ulysses S. Grant decides that he has to kind of push Sheridan a little bit. And so he sent a message to Sheridan and said, I want to meet with you in Charlestown, West Virginia on September the 17th. And that was it. So, we kind of think about the worlds in which we operate and function. If I get a message from my boss, from the dean who says, I want to meet with you in a few days, and that's all that the dean says, imagination is going to run wild. And so Sheridan's imagination began to run wild. And he's thinking, well, worst case scenario, he's coming here to fire me. Maybe best case scenario, he doesn't fire me, but he gives me a plan to implement that I'm not comfortable with. And so Sheridan really felt that it was crucial for him to go into that meeting in Charlestown with a plan. But in order to formulate a plan, he had to know, where is Jubal Early? How many troops does Jubal Early have? Can Jubal Early be reinforced? So he was talking with his friend George Crook, who commanded the Army's 8th Corps, and said, if I could just find someone, because Sheridan at the time is in Berryville. So Berryville, sits just to the east of Winchester. Confederates are in the vicinity of Winchester. And Sheridan told Crook, he said, if I could just have someone behind Confederate lines who could provide some degree of information that would help me formulate a plan, it would be fantastic. And Crook was basically saying, well, yes, it would. And it just so happens that I know someone who might be willing to help. And Crook had spent a lot of time in the Valley. He knew the Unionist families really well, and he knew Rebecca Wright. So that, she's in her early 20s, Quaker school teacher. And he told Sheridan, if we could get to her, she might be willing to provide us information. The challenge, of course, is how do you get to Rebecca Wright? So Philip Sheridan's scouts, they had come into contact with Thomas Laws, who was an enslaved man from Clark County, Virginia. And they thought that Thomas Laws, if the opportunity ever presented itself, would be a great candidate to serve as a messenger, to serve as part of this intelligence gathering operation for the Army of the Shenandoah. And so Phil Sheridan met with Laws, and he asked him if he would carry a message to Rebecca Wright on September 16th and ask her to relay any vital information, important information. So Tom Laws had no idea who Rebecca Wright was. And he said, I don't know her. I'm willing to do this, but I know people who will probably be able to point me into the direction of, Rebecca Wright, where she lives. So Sheridan wrote this note on a small piece of tissue paper, wadded it up very, very carefully into basically a pill capsule. So if you think of like a gel cap today, wadded it up into this pill capsule, and Tom Laws carried it in his mouth. Now, Tom Laws was someone who could fairly easily pass in and out of those Confederate lines in Winchester. He had a pass that was signed by Confederate officials, allowing him to come in and go out of Winchester 3 times a week. And so he could come and go without arousing any suspicions, because we're expecting him to come in. He has this pass to sell vegetables to soldiers and to civilians. But Sheridan gave him this message in this capsule just in case Confederates decided to stop him and question him. And Laws, of course, could swallow it, and he could conceal his role. But the fact that Tom Laws was chosen and was actually able to make it through those Confederate lines into Winchester reveals a great deal about intelligence during the Civil War. One of the things that Confederates simply did not understand, and there's a lot of scholarship on this, they did not believe an African American had the mental aptitude to carry out important intelligence gathering work. Federal forces did. They understood the great importance of African Americans on this road to victory, the restoration of the Union and destroying slavery. And so, Sheridan felt pretty confident because of how the message was concealed, because of the past, and because how he knew Confederates were going to view this African American man, that the likelihood of him being challenged was almost slim to none. So Tom Laws makes it into Winchester, gets to Rebecca Wright's home around noon on September the 16th, and knocks on the door. Rebecca Wright opens the door up, and he pushes her inside the house, slams the door behind him, and locks it. Now, Rebecca Wright had never met Tom Laws before, so she's, wondering what's going to happen here. And Tom Laws, of course, could see that Rebecca Wright was a little bit unnerved by all this. He was about 20 years older than she was. And he basically told her, he said, calm down, pulled a message out of his mouth, and, let her read this message. Rebecca Wright's initial reaction was, no, I'm not going to help. As much as I want the Union to succeed, if I provide information, then it's probably going to mean I'm going to be found out as a spy, and I'm going to be killed, and my family's going to be killed. And so her quick knee-jerk reaction was unequivocally, no, not going to help. This is where I think Tom Laws is so critical. Tom Laws could have accepted this answer and said, okay, I tried, and leave. Tom Laws said, I'm going to give you several hours to think about this. I want you to think about the pros and the cons. I'll come back around 3 o'clock. So here's this guy who's serving as a messenger. Basically, he's just killing a few hours in Winchester. while Rebecca Wright is going through, should I or shouldn't I? And while Laws was gone and gave her this time, Rebecca Wright was thinking. She was talking to her mother, and her mother, really played a critical role in Rebecca deciding to reveal what she knew, because her mother basically said, yes, if you do this, you might be killed. I might be killed. But she said, we have to think about the sacrifices that so many of our Unionist friends and neighbors and soldiers are making in this conflict, making that ultimate supreme sacrifice. And so she said, if we're really serious about restoring the Union, maybe this is something you need to do. And so she thought about that advice. She thought about how poorly her father had been treated by Confederates under Stonewall Jackson in 1862, by Jubal Early in the summer of 1864. And so finally she decided to help. Once she made that decision to help, Rebecca Wright thought, well, what in God's name am I going to tell Philip Sheridan? And so she thought back to a conversation that she had with a Confederate officer a few days before Tom Laws showed up. So sometimes, life is about timing. And so 2 days before Tom Laws showed up, there was a young Confederate lieutenant. And I have researched Rebecca Wright for a long time. And I have not been able to find the identity of this Confederate lieutenant, but he was convalescing at a home next door to Rebecca Wright's. He knew nothing about Rebecca Wright's allegiances and what she was going to eventually do. He just looked at her working in the garden every day and thought, she's pretty, I want to meet her. And so he finally mustered up the strength. On September 14th, can I come over? Can I have tea? And Rebecca Wright's like, yeah, fine, whatever. I'll just humor the guy. And so they're sitting down, they're making small talk, and this officer tried to impress Rebecca Wright with military intelligence, not being at all aware of how she was going to use this information a few days from now. And so what he had told Rebecca Wright was that there was an entire Confederate division commanded by Joseph Kershaw and an artillery battalion commanded by Major Wilfred Cutshaw who were leaving the valley, because they had been sent to the valley, earlier in the summer to help deal with Sheridan, but Sheridan didn't seem like he was doing much. And so ultimately, Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army at Petersburg, they needed those troops more than apparently Early needed them in the valley. So he told this to Rebecca Wright. And at the time, Rebecca Wright was like, great, who cares? What am I supposed to do with this? And then Laws shows up. And so she writes this information to Sheridan. Laws takes it back to Philip Sheridan, and it's on this information that he starts to formulate a plan, because now he knows basically how many troops Early has. He knows that he's not being reinforced. He knows that troops are coming out of the valley. And so Sheridan, when he goes to this meeting in Charlestown on the 17th, he tells, Ulysses S. Grant, before you say anything, here's my plan. And Grant listens to it. He holds his own plan, keeps it to himself, and he tells Philip Sheridan simply to go in. So, these are two individuals who are so critical to ultimate Union success. I mean, they made the ultimate, they took a major risk here in serving as a spy for Philip Sheridan. And, after the battle was over, the very first stop Phil Sheridan made was Rebecca Wright's home, because he wanted to meet her. He wanted to thank her for everything she had done. And right before Phil Sheridan left, he said, is there anything that I could do to repay you? And Rebecca Wright said, there is one thing. She said, don't tell anyone about this, because she knew the dire consequences of what would happen to her if people found out.
Oh, my goodness. Well, it sounds like there are multiple heroes of this story, not just Phil Sheridan, but many others who made it all happen. Is there any other topic that you would like to touch upon that we might have overlooked?
Well, yeah, if I could just kind of talk about the postscript to Rebecca Wright and Tom Laws.
Sure, please.
Yeah. So, Rebecca Wright, again said, don't tell anyone about this. And Sheridan, he kept his promise until early part of 1867. So in January of 1867, Phil Sheridan, who was actually commanding troops in New Orleans at the time, he sent one of his staff officers to Winchester to present Rebecca Wright with a gift and a note, a handwritten note of gratitude. And so when the staff officer shows up, hands Rebecca Wright the note, thanking her for all this information, how important she was not only to Sheridan, but to the Union war effort. Philip Sheridan also had attached to this note a one-of-a-kind Tiffany and Company manufactured watch chain brooch. There were all kind of like saber, charms and stuff on it. And when Rebecca Wright received this, obviously she was ecstatic. She wanted to show this off, but her mother said, it's probably not a good idea to be wearing a one-of-a-kind watch out in public that costs so much money because people are going to say, where does this come from? So what ends up happening is there was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun who was boarding at the Wright home at the time. And he was curious. He thought, well, why in the world is Sheridan's staff officer showing up here to give a note and a gift? What's this all about? So it turns out that Rebecca Wright's sister, Hannah Wright, who was a pro-Confederate sympathizer during the war. So, we talk about divided loyalties in the country. I mean, here's the divided loyalties within the family. Hannah Wright kind of spilled the beans to this reporter. And then finally, February 20th, 1867, there was an article in the Winchester newspaper that Rebecca Wright had received a gift from, and I'm quoting now, General Barn Burning Sheridan. And once people found out about this, Rebecca Wright was basically forced to leave Winchester with her entire family. And so she, at this point, appealed to Sheridan for help. She went to Philadelphia for a little bit, wrote to Sheridan, asked him for help, and Sheridan, along with General Grant, were able to secure her a job as a clerk in the Treasury Department. And she held that post in the U.S. Treasury Department in Washington until her death in 1915. And what's always interesting to me about her story, her post-war story, she became a celebrity. I mean, she traveled the country telling her story. She met with, groups of Union veterans all over the place. There were souvenir photographs that were sold of her holding the chain and the watch and all this kind of stuff. She actually became a pretty prominent figure within the women's suffrage movement in the late 19th, early 20th century, kind of using her celebrity that was built out of her role as a spy. But there were various points in her career where the Treasury Department was undergoing, government downsizing. And there was one point near the end of Sheridan's life where the Secretary of the Treasury, his name was James Folger, was thinking about firing Rebecca Wright to save money. And so she wrote to Sheridan, and Sheridan intervened, and he said, you can fire everyone in the Treasury Department. You can fire yourself, but you cannot fire Rebecca Wright, because you can't forget, all that this woman did for the Republic. Tom Laws's story was largely quiet. Tom Laws, he lived out his remaining years. He died in the late 1890s, lived out his remaining years in Clark County. There were efforts to kind of expose Laws by a group of Union veterans who came to the Valley to dedicate a monument in the Winchester National Cemetery to Union General David Russell, who was killed at 3rd Winchester. And so they actually took Laws to Washington. There's a post-war meeting in the 1880s between Rebecca Wright and Tom Laws. The War Department offers Tom Laws a job, but he basically says, I'm getting old. He's in his 70s at this point. I just want to live quietly and not have to deal with, threats against my life or whatever. But what's interesting about his story is people kind of knew in the Valley that there was an African-American man who helped Rebecca Wright, but never really knew the name or the identity. There was one guy from Winchester. His last name was Dixon. He was a charlatan. He was trying to portray himself as Tom Laws and making up all these stories and totally fictitious, of course. But it's interesting how Laws wanted no credit because he was, concerned about his safety. And then there's this imposter who wants all the credit for doing absolutely nothing.
Oh, that's amazing. What I love about researching these histories is it always opens up more obscure histories that are, incredible stories that really merit a lot more visibility in the world. So with that, thank you so much, Jonathan Noyalas from Shenandoah University. Thank you for spending the time with us and explaining more about Sheridan's ride and the Battle of Cedar Creek. We really appreciate your input today, and thank you so much, and have a great summer.
All right, thanks. Appreciate it.